Yeah, financial planning, financial literacy is a passion of yours. I read recently the 2024 trustees report on Social Security says Social Security will be gone by in
Within 10
by
years,
2033 if there's not a significant change to the funding. 2/3 of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. 2/3. 50% of Americans that make $100,000 a year or more live paycheck to paycheck. What's wrong?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is we didn't focus on the basics. You know, as I've said to some of our leaders at the Texas Education Agency, I said, you know, when I look at the TEA plan that says here's 187 days worth of work that a teacher's supposed to do, there's nothing in there about ensuring that they have success when they leave school. Okay, you do reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and all the rest. And I said, actually, the greatest one for everybody is understanding how to read, right? Because if I can read and read for understanding and critical thinking, I can read any subject if I'm interested in it, and I'll be a master of it. But if you think about what happens in different countries, our education system is predicated on passing all these massive tests that we like to give the kids because that's the measure of success, right? And so when I look at this 98% that don't have enough money to retire on, I said, so essentially what we're doing is creating smart poor people. And I go, so is that a outcome that we want? And then if you go back to the founding documents of our country, you know, there's a clause in there that says it's about the prosperity of the nation, which means the people have to be prosperous. But who is building the skills? So like, you know, my hero of the American Revolution is Ben Franklin because he was the most entrepreneurial of everybody. And if you look at one business he still has today operating in Philadelphia, started in 1787, is still in operation today.
Wow.
And so, and that's not even the oldest business in the world. You know, I think one of the Italian bell makers has that history. But I think this is the challenge. You know, what are you building for? What are you creating wealth for? You know, are you creating it just for, you know, holding it, or are you going to use it for something good? You know, I mean, I think that's why they called it currency. It has to circulate, right? And so I think, you know, people have a bad relationship with money. You know, and right now the biggest driver is go buy something. I mean, you know, you look at this season, I mean, tons of commercials, you know, every 10 seconds or more, somebody's telling you to buy something, but not save something.
Well, as an entrepreneur, like, you know, I'm 43, and it took till 40-ish to realize that money is just a hammer.
Yeah.
Because, and what I mean by that is, before I was a business owner, it's just, oh, I need money to do this, I want to do this, I want to go to eat, I want to buy a TV, I want to buy stuff.
Yeah.
And then when you have a business, as a business owner, and I don't know if this translates to the corporate C-suites, just because one of the things I have noticed at the EMBA program at SMU is you've got these high up VP corporate who that's their entire life.
Yeah, that's right.
And their solution is like, we'll just use more money. And I'm like, well, what money? Like, where are you going to get it if you own the business? And the point I'm trying to make is, before I owned a business, money was just this thing that that was elusive, you wanted it, but now it's just a hammer. It's just a tool like anything else.
Well, and that's right. I mean, I think the challenge is how that relationship with money goes. Like, you can borrow, and then the question is, so what do you do? So, I mean, the business solutions to overborrowing is bankruptcy, right? I mean, if you can't pay it back. And so the behavior right now is, well, I can go get other people's money to do my work, but then the question is, do I have responsibility to the money that I borrowed and I'm using effectively? You know, and this is kind of like when you get into governance and shareholders and all of that. You know, what is your fiduciary responsibility to make sure that you get the outcome you want?
To that point, do you think culturally, you know, you talked about responsibility to those shareholders. There's so many examples that you see all the time of people just like either outright fraud, stealing. Do you think that's always been there, or do you think maybe there's a shift in culture that makes a little bit less where people are a little bit more prompt to take advantage of that situation,
Well,
that relationship.
I think there's this is part of the weakness of the human condition, is that, in one place you can live in the 7 virtues, right? On the other hand, you live in the 7, now I've just forgotten the term, but you're essentially on the downside, right? And so when you think about that, if you're kind of in the negative world, you're going to be full of greed and avarice and all of that. And or I should say, it's the 7 deadly sins is what I should have said. But the 7 deadly sins is where people kind of zigzag from the good side to the bad side, right? Because that's how a lot of people go through life. Kids do something, their parents correct them, or their teachers correct them, or their friends correct them, or maybe they don't, right? If they're running with a bad crowd, they're all in that 7 deadly sins world side of things. And so I think if you think of it that way, where is your level of responsibility? Where is your ethics at, right? So ethics, discipline, and focus become really part of it. So you hold everybody accountable. Now, not every CEO does that. Not every chairman of the board does that. I mean, we can take all kinds of examples of people that have not been successful, right? And so at the end of the day, I think part of our challenge right now is, do we want to bring up the ethical behavior of business to a level that it needs to be? Otherwise, you live somewhat on the edge of I guess maybe a corrupt approach to doing business. And so if you do that, then the question is, do your employees trust you, right? So who wants to work with somebody that's a corrupt boss? Because eventually the employees will leave. They'll eventually say, well, I can support you up to a certain point, but if you do a lot of criminal things, you violate my ethics, then I'm leaving.
And historically in the military, not our military, hopefully, but I'm thinking there's probably many lessons of the British Empire where if the lieutenant or the captain was too corrupt, he would magically die in a battle from the back. Yeah, I'm sure that's happened many a time. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, soldiers figure out a way to survive.
Yeah, well, and that's part of survival, right? So at the end of the day, if that person is considered so evil, usually the community takes care of the evil. Now, structurally, we take care of it through court systems and,
right,
law enforcement and so forth. But at the end of the day, in business, business can hide a little bit because, guys can dress up in jackets, ties, and suits and look good, and hey, everybody thinks, hey, they're doing a really great job.
Well, creative financing. I mean, look at Enron. Yeah. Enron was able to do what they did for years.
Oh yeah. Well, and Enron's story is pretty interesting because I have a little history there. I had met some of those guys in Houston, and their CFO, Andy Fastow, who's been a convicted criminal under that program. If you go back and look at his history, so this gets to be, is the person qualified to be in the job that they should be in? He was running their South American operation. He wasn't a good operational manager. They promoted him to the CFO. And then he started creating all these sub-companies using the shares of Enron to finance them when there was really no money. And so what people would do is they'd sell their shares, make money, and it was a house built on sand, essentially. And eventually it collapsed, and I had a little bit of experience with them operationally in Southern California because at our Marine base in San Diego County, there at Camp Pendleton, we were getting power from Southern Cal Edison. So their nuclear plant, which was San Onofre nuclear plant, was kind of right at the northwest edge of the base. And of course I would visit them, basically for security, how do we protect this nuclear plant? But what was interesting was when they started playing the commodities game with power, and Southern California was turning off street lights and traffic lights because they couldn't afford to pay at 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 5 o'clock in the afternoon in the middle of a traffic jam, causing accidents and all this. It made absolutely no sense. And of course, if you go back and read the court cases and all of that, it was a big joke down in Houston, what they were doing to Southern California. In fact, if you go and look at why ERCOT delayed development of ERCOT here and the deregulation, because what happened in California, they said, well, we got to wait. And I remember in the early days, we had talked to ERCOT and said, look, the experience in Southern California was they had no computer systems to manage commodity movement, right? So if you had different prices at different times of the day, if that's what you were paying, you didn't know it, because what they had was little paper, what would you call it, little paper tags that said, oh, okay, at 2 o'clock, the price was this. And they were putting us in a closet, literally, in the back of their office at Southern Cal Edison. And I said, well, how are you guys going to figure that out? I said, they didn't even have a spreadsheet, more or less a database to figure out, what the linear regression was on, what the costs were, because they could have figured out the average cost if they understood that and done the mathematical models. But they weren't prepared for that at all.
So we talked about financial literacy, financial education, and individuals not being equipped to make good decisions or not making good decisions. And we talked about corporate greed and other issues related to that. I served as a chairman of a bank in 08, 09, and we ran that bank well, and we made good decisions on loans and how we managed the bank. Other banks made very bad decisions, made bad loans, and they were bailed out by the federal government. There were people that engaged in unquestionably criminal behavior, and yet these large institutions are being bailed out and there's no accountability.
Absolutely.
I think that sends a terrible message.
Absolutely. Well, I think 2008 is a good example, but if you look at it historically, about every 10 years we have an episode of something.
Yeah.
And 2008 sticks in my mind a lot because I was invited back to Harvard to give a speech to the MBA class there, and I was kind of a little bit, miffed at why many of the graduates of that program were down on Wall Street, literally collapsing the government of the United States. So I walked into the auditorium, of course it's full, and I stood there for about 2 minutes in silence. And of course that made a lot of people uncomfortable, but I was doing it for a purpose. And I said, well, now that I have your attention, so why are the alumni of this program down on Wall Street trying to collapse the government of the United States? And everybody knew what I was talking about, because at Harvard MBA program, at that time, they had not taught ethics for over 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And I said, so you can make a lot of money in the world of business, but at the end of the day, can you do it where you don't harm everybody? And the fact that when you looked at the securitized mortgages that were being created by different companies, Andrew Mozzello, it comes to mind with Countrywide, for example, or even Citigroup. And, essentially unqualified people for mortgages were getting mortgages. And again, a house built on sand. And so eventually it had the underlying fundamentals were going to collapse. And, I think, some of the hedge fund guys I've talked to during that period, a couple of them made really good money because they bet against the fact that this was really good business,
right.
And so they took out insurance policies that the mortgage industry was going to collapse. Well, it did, and of course they made billions of dollars for their hedge fund because of that. But it's not the best way to make money, but they made money because they managed the risk, right? And so, and I think this gets back to all the fundamentals. Are you fundamentally qualified to go get a loan? If you're not, are you building for it? Because, everybody wants things sooner than later. And, for the business guy that wants a larger amount of accounts receivables, that's an asset. So, but if it's account receivable that can't be paid, it's pretty much a liability. And I think that's where we were with the mortgage industry at that point.